Good morning.
Morning.
As most of you know, we had the privilege of living in England for about 6 years. And I have to say that it was one of the most beautiful and fascinating places I've ever seen. You just pick a little tiny one-lane road and drive and see where it leads you. And we really loved the history of the place. The whole family, we'd like to get up really early, or Karen would pick a place on the map, and we'd just take a little tiny road and drive off into the woods. And it'd be ropey, twisty roads, or if it was a straight road, you know it was built by the Romans. But for the most part, England had these twisty roads, and the woods would open up, and there would be this village and a castle. And it would be so cool to spend the day climbing around the ramparts, looking down the castle walls, going up those big spirals. We just had a blast. And I'm sure that most of you as a child probably dreamt of living in a castle, what that would be like. The whole idea just sounded neat. Those big round turrets and those spiral staircases, and then the great banquet halls and meeting rooms. And it was all surrounded by a moat with a drawbridge. I mean, how cool would that be? Well, it sure sounded neat, but the more we took tours, the more we read about history, the less neat it actually sounded. Well, neat is really the descriptive word, because it was a lot less than neat. We found out that medieval living was pretty dirty, smelly, and vermin infested. Anybody who's read history knows that the Romans had occupied England for a few hundred years, and that the Romans built opulent bathhouses. The most famous bathhouse was in the town of Bath. That's what it was named after. And it was this beautiful building that was fed by natural hot springs. So it was a really cool place. But we found out that when the Romans left England, we think they took all the soap with them. It was a little different after the Romans left. And we've heard different conflicting stories about just how clean medieval times were and what the Brits used to actually do. Some of the stories say that they only washed once a year, usually in the spring when it was warm enough to use the water. Hence you get the term June brides, because that's when people could get close enough to each other and marry. But there were other stories that said that they were a lot cleaner than that. But Queen Elizabeth was pretty well documented that they considered her a clean freak because she insisted on having a bath once a month. The whole living in a castle thing didn't exactly scream luxury either. There was one time we had all taken this tour, and we all took turns sitting on the throne of the castle, or the latrine. It was actually the castle where Queen Isabella, she was the one with the over-flattering depiction in Braveheart that we happened to watch last night. She wasn't exactly a nice lady. She killed her husband with a hot poker. But anyhow, we were in her castle, sitting on the throne, which was really nothing more than a hole cut through the wall that led to the outside, which leads me to the moat. You know, being surrounded by a moat wasn't exactly pleasant either, because the moat was the sewage system of the castle. That explains why people didn't swim through it to storm the castle. Could you imagine how all that smelled? It's probably not exactly what you were thinking about when you were a little girl lying in your canopy bed, imagining Prince Charming climbing up the ramparts to come and save you. Or when you were a little boy like me in the snow fort or the refrigerator box or some other random cardboard box, and you were He-Man in Castle Grayskull. Medieval times, there was no concept of germs and how they had spread. They used to think that diseases were spread by bad smells, so they would carry this bag of rose petals around with them, and they'd sniff the rose petals to keep the bad smells away so that they wouldn't get sick. Well, because there was no concept of germs and sickness was spread from one person to another pretty quickly. And the plagues of Europe had wiped out a third of Europe. There was only one village in Italy that we had read about where they had isolated the plague victims rather brutally, and most of their population in their city was spared from the plague. But doctors had no idea that going from person to person with all those same instruments, they were actually spreading the disease around. Even right up to the Civil War, the doctors there didn't wash between patients or wash their instruments, so when they did surgeries, they just spread filth and disease up and down their entire ward. everything was unclean. It wasn't until Louis Pasteur came along that anybody had the understanding of disease and what causes disease. And there was a whole other world hidden to the eye, a whole very unclean world. Now when you take into account the knowledge and the level of hygiene of those ancient times, it's no wonder that the life expectancy of those people was around 40 years. Well, I was reading through Leviticus, and I was just amazed at how many times it talked about unclean things. And the word unclean in Leviticus is actually mentioned 128 times just in that one chapter. It talks about all the different types of animals and insects that are unclean, and how to handle someone with wounds, and how to handle the dead, and both animals and people. And there was really a lot of instructions. And if you think about the knowledge of the ancient world, it was pretty amazing what was deemed unclean and what wasn't proper to eat. And what you should do if you've touched something that was unclean or not right. There were instructions on how to keep someone who had touched unclean separate for a period of time. There were instructions on how to handle things like blood and how to wash up afterwards. And if you applied science to these instructions, that was pretty neat. It was exactly what not to touch if you didn't want to spread disease. And it had a separation of people for a time that had touched something unclean. And how perfect that was if there was an incubation period so that that person wasn't around everybody else, taking out his entire family or entire clan. It also had you differentiate between animals that chewed cud and animals that didn't. And if you think about an animal that doesn't chew cud, that's an omnivore, and they're a lot more likely to have parasites and disease. The water creatures without fins would have been bottom feeders. And if you look at the sanitation of the day or the remotes of the castle, that was some pretty polluted water. And even today, people can get really sick from the bottom feeders and filter feeders like oysters. It's okay because I never really liked oysters and a half shell anyhow. But there were also instructions on how to make the unclean clean. There are a lot of references to washing. In fact, the word washing is used 42 times in Leviticus. On how to clean a weeping wound, on how you should wash after you've touched something unclean. A method of making unclean into clean and holy again. Washing on the outside makes your outside clean. But we have other filter things. How do we wash our insides? What if your inside and your soul has dirt on it? Sin is something that makes your soul unclean. It's as dangerous to a community as germs. In Mosaic law, they separated out the people who were sick. And if you think about it, in a land without antibiotics or antiviral medicines, that was really a matter of survival. But what do you do to ensure that it was just something that they did to ensure that infections didn't travel from one person to another. This is just what was done to make sure that people didn't take out an entire group. But does sin become infectious? Can you have thought travel from one person to another? Well, I think you can. If you look at like the gang culture and the drug culture and pornography, they've spread throughout our society faster than the plagues of Europe. The more you're exposed to something, the less shocking it seems to you, and the more likely it is to invade your thoughts, in your home, in your family. We watch videos that make young gangsters seem cool. They're infecting our kids with lies that tell them that's how they should be. We watch TV shows called 16 and Pregnant, making it seem like that's just something that normal 16-year-old girls go through. And we're constantly bombarded with sex and drugs in movies like Friends with Benefits, or Harold and Kumar smoking their way through some other weird escapade. We have people spreading the infection of thought that anything that feels good is okay to do. They tell us that pornography is simply an expression of what God's given us, and it's not. It's really a big business. It's such a big business that the majority of the technology that developed streaming videos so that you can watch Netflix was developed for the porn industry. It's an infection that tells people a lot of things that are really wrong are okay. It's so infectious that now it's not uncommon for our kids in school to take pornographic pictures of themselves or their classmates, and they start spreading it around through their social networks more quickly than they've ever realized what they've done is actually a felony. Webster's dictionaries even added a new word for it, sexting. I found out something interesting when I was digging through the U.S. Census data. And yes, I'm one of those geeks that loves to dig through data and look at maps. And I do actually look at the Census Bureau and FBI statistics and look at crime statistics, voting statistics. I guess it's just part of being a numbers geek. Well, anyhow, I was studying single-parent homes and teen pregnancies. And I was looking at the census data and the maps. And what I found is that there's huge numbers of teen pregnancies per capita. And I wanted to look at per capita because I didn't want it tainted by just numbers in certain areas. Because if it's per capita, it should be something that's even spread across the country. And I have the map here. And what you can see, I know, you can see these maps afterwards. You know, everybody that doesn't have glasses, like me. But what you can see is most of the teen pregnancies happen in the high densely populated areas. It's something that does spread around. Well, then I went to the FBI crime statistics and I was looking at their maps, county by county. And again, this was all by per capita, so it wasn't tainted by other populations. And here is the map of property crimes. So for all of the shoplifting, the car thefts, the house break-ins, all of the property crimes, again, it's concentrated in areas of high population. Well, I went and looked at their map of violent crimes. Well, contrary to what you hear in horror films, you know, because I've got a teenage boy who watches a lot of horror films, most of the horror films of today tell you that you've got the nice family from the city that goes out into rural America, and they're usually captured by some religious zealots, inbreds, or murderous small town folks who spend their time filleting them one by one until they return to the safety and security of their city. I mean, geez, if you didn't get the message from Rest Stop, I mean, there was Children of the Corn 1 and 2, and their remakes, and you had Wrong Turn 1, 2, 3, and To Drive the Point Home, Wrong Turn 4. Well, in reality, the chances of getting murdered or filleted are pretty unlikely in rural areas per capita. Again, it seems to be concentrated in our cities where you have population. After all, Ted Bundy, Son of Sam, and John Gacy were actually city dwellers and not rural religious people. Well, what was really interesting is when I look at all these maps together, one after another, you can overlay the maps on top of each other, and it's all pretty much the same counties. They're all a map, or they're all a match. So it's almost like one begat the other, or doesn't it? Then I found another map of voting blocks, county by county. And these would be the different areas which were left and which were right-leaning. And what I found is the areas that would most likely vote in a manner that tells people that it's okay, or that they're likely to vote to legalize drugs, or that pornography is freedom of speech, or that we're all just victims rather than taking responsibility. All four of those maps were a fairly close match to each other. When you look at the maps, it almost seems like there's areas that are cancerous, like one begat the other. It almost seems like disease that spreads. Like the plagues of Europe, the large, densely populated cities were hit the hardest, and the rural areas were pretty much left alone. Well, how can that be? Can you sit on a bus and catch a thought? Or can you? It's almost like a disease spreading. It's so infectious If it's infectious, if it's unclean, how do you make yourself clean again? How do you clean your mind? How do you clean your soul? I think you can go back to Leviticus. You go back to Mosaic law. You wash yourself. You can wash. You can use water. You can take the unclean things and wash and make them clean again. I was doing some more reading on the internet, and I found out that the Greek word for wash was baptismos, and its root was bapto, meaning to dip or to dunk or submerge. So the Old Testament in the Greek language would have been using a word derived from baptism to wash their unclean things, to make their unclean things clean again. Well, that brings me to John the Baptist. I always liked John the Baptist. I thought he was kind of like a rebel with a cause. And I like his description. Just the whole persona of him, he just sounds like a cool, neat guy. And if you read in Matthew chapter 3, it says, "And the same John had his raiment of camel hair and a leather girdle about his loins, and he ate meat of locusts and wild honey." I thought this was a cool guy. This is somebody I can identify with. I mean, he wears leather, I wear leather. He'll eat locusts, I'll eat pretty much anything. I'm betting that if John the Baptist had come here today, he'd been driven here on a Harley. You know, wait a minute, if you think about this, the Greek word for baptism, or bapto, being dip, dunk, or clean. You know, I'm glad they didn't translate his name the wrong way, because, and they left part of it in Greek, otherwise he would have been John the Cleaner. It would sound like a mobster. Or the Dipper, or Duncan John. And geez, the last one sounds like he's either a player for the Mavs or he works at the donut shop. I'm sorry, I digress. Well, anyhow, John the Baptist was out washing souls. If you had a dirty soul and you needed to clean it, you need to remove all those impurities. You need to make a commitment to change your life. You need to change your soul so that you can go from being isolated and unclean to being welcome in the presence of the Lord. Amen. You know that you can't literally wash a dirty soul with water. You don't walk down to the grocery store and look for something that's advertising that can get out stubborn sins. Irish Spring, Cheer, or even lava with the power of pumice can't wash away those stubborn sins. The waters that we wash in are symbolic. It's a step in your life. It's a way to wash away what you needed to let go of. It's a commitment to the Lord. It's a rebirth. It's a washing in the Holy Spirit. If you reemerge with a fresh soul or clean soul, you're ready to lead a different life, a different way. Once you're washed, your soul are ready to be amongst those who are saved. You're a reborn person, not infected with the sins that can spoil, that can poison an entire community. We're not perfect beings, though. We know that from time to time we're going to fall, and we'll get grasping on the knees of our soul. Well, the beauty of the grace of God is that you can rewash yourself. You can ask God for forgiveness. But that doesn't mean that you can just keep sinning because you think God's going to keep forgiving you time after time. That's not the way it works. It's just like when you were a kid and you were outside playing in your Sunday best, exactly the way your mom told you not to, and you fell and got stains all over your clothes. Your mom could probably get the stains out, but that clothing was weakened or damaged or marred a little bit. Your sin, although washed away and forgiven, is still in your memory. You'll always be a different person than you were before you sinned. You have forgiveness, but wouldn't you have been a better person in the long run had you not sinned at all? We wash away those sins with the grace of our Creator, with our recommitment to God, through the blessings of the Holy Spirit. We seek true forgiveness. We have the desire to follow Christ and to sin no more after that. Thought is infectious. I think I've shown that. Not only are the waters of baptism washing your soul, but if you're truly committed, truly changed, and truly saved, you're not only clean, but you're vaccinated for reinfection. Now that you're truly saved and a truly clean person, you need to go out and spread the message that all can be clean. You need to be the infectious agent, telling others and realigning their thoughts. You need to make the living the good life seem like that's the norm rather than the other way around, so that everybody can look at you for inspiration rather than looking for others who aren't so good. All can live a better life. All are deserving of the grace of God because Christ paid the price. Christ paved the way. You can give up the unclean, wash away your sins, and return to the greater community, the community of love, the community of God. And it's your job to show others how they can clean theirs.